Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace.
So today we're repurposing a section. We're going to go to the mess deck, which as you can see I haven't updated forever and a day, and I'm going to change this to a page showing channels that I recommend in terms of I've watched the channels and either I know the people personally or I can otherwise vouch for the accuracy of the historical content they put out. So quickly relabel everything. And then I'm going to actually repurpose a preset people template because that has a nice little header and some nice circular pictures. So then I just go in and delete the old messdex post. Now we've got our original template, change the title of that nice and quickly to other channels track recommends. And then I just go into design, select a person, replace their image with the channel logo in question. You might find this logo fairly familiar, and then put in their title and YouTube link in the description below. So there's a clickable link. The channel logos are fairly low res, but I can solve that by just changing the layout slightly, populate for the other 6 entries, slightly alter the text layout so they're all on single lines, and job done.
So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show.
Something that will stand out to anybody who starts analysing battleship versus battleship engagements in detail is that right up until the advent of extremely accurate fire control radar at the end of World War II, almost every engagement in which there was a hit, or multiple hits perhaps, was usually characterised by the next few salvos missing. Now, this might seem odd because surely once you've got the correct data plugged into your fire control system, as evidenced by the fact that you've hit your target, surely it should be fairly easy to keep hitting your target. But from the time that long-range salvo fire became a necessary thing in naval warfare around the late 1880s, early 1890s, through to about 1943-44, this is a persistent pattern. As we mentioned, once you get to the end of World War II, you have extremely accurate radar-directed gunfire control systems, and those will more easily allow you to hit with one salvo after another. But unless you happen to be USS Washington engaging Hiroshima at near point-blank range, in most other circumstances, you can expect at least a few of your salvos to go a little bit off, even when the telltale plume of smoke has already erupted from an enemy vessel. As with most things associated with long-distance naval gunnery, it's not as simple a solution as you might otherwise think, and in fact there are 5 main reasons why a battleship might miss after scoring hits. So we're going to look at those. Now there may be a number of secondary reasons which might contribute to the issue, but those are really a discussion for another time. So, in no particular order, reason number 1, enemy evasive action. Now, this one might seem to be the most obvious. An enemy takes a hit. This is not generally held to be a good thing if you are the captain of the enemy vessel, and you don't want to be hit again. So, logically, assuming that you have the freedom of movement, which admittedly you might not have if you're part of a major battle line, but let's say in a World War II engagement environment, the latter stages of the Battle of Tsushima, or some other engagement wherein the captain actually has at least a degree of freedom of maneuverability, you might well conclude, well, I have been hit. Therefore, the enemy ship has a correct fire control solution to my vessel. If I keep going at this same course and speed, logically, the enemy will hit me with their next salvo. Therefore, the best thing to do is to not be where that salvo is most likely to land. And depending on the engagement, I have maybe 30 seconds at worst, maybe a minute, minute and a half at best, in order to enact some kind of evasive measure. Now, obviously, there are secondary things you can do, like generating smoke, but the most obvious things to do are to change your course and or speed. So if you're at full speed, perhaps drop 3 or 4 knots. If you're at 2/3 speed, maybe go to full speed. If you're heading in a straight line, then start turning to port or starboard. If you're already turning to port or starboard, maybe straighten up or turn the other way. And the reason that this might cause your opponent to miss is that an awful lot of fire control systems would only spit out a correct solution for a set course and speed, and if you vary that, then the solution has to be reset, which means your opponent has to spot what you're doing, realize what you're doing, and then take the correct estimates as to how you are changing the parameters of the fire control solution. So what's the bearing change? What's the rate of the bearing change if you're continuing a turn? What's the new speed, if there is one? How much speed are you losing in the turn, even if you yourself haven't altered the total power output of the ship? More advanced fire control systems can sustain an accurate fire control solution even when a ship is in a turn, so that there is a continuous rate of bearing change. However, even there, a change in that parameter, so let's say you were turning at 30 degrees to port, and now you're turning at 30 degrees to starboard, that change still needs to be put into the fire control system so it can start its calculations over again. This is where radar-directed fire control comes in handy once it's become precise enough, because unlike a human spotter who has to keep checking and rechecking and then signaling various changes, a radar system can just input results pretty much as fast as it's receiving returns. Although, admittedly, for most World War II systems, there is a degree of user input between the radar reception and the fire control system, but exactly how much depends on the system in question. So, of course, if the enemy has had to recalculate their fire control solution, simple evasive action may mean that that fire control solution is not as accurate as the one they had previously, and may in fact be completely wrong. For example, if they think you're turning at 25 degrees, but you're actually turning at 30, or they think that your final speed after a turn is 22 knots, but in fact it's 24, or something like that. Reason number 2 might be that the enemy is range seeking. Now, range seeking and associated terms cover a wide variety of specific behaviors, but essentially it amounts to your enemy is not actually firing based on we think this solution is the absolute accurate one. Your enemy is firing on the basis of we think this is roughly the right solution, but we're not going to fire the entire salvo of guns. We're going to fire a series of half, third, or quarter salvos across a variety of parameters, and hopefully one of them will be in approximately the right area. So in World War II, for example, a fairly common practice would be to fire half salvos, so 4 or 5 guns per salvo, whereas back in World War I, there was a practice amongst German ships at various points to actually fire single turrets, one after the other. All German capital ship turrets at that point were twin turrets, so if you have a broadside of, let's say, 10 guns, you can fire 5 pairs of shells. Now, some of you might think, well, hang on, that's not going to be very accurate. We know half salvos should ideally be 4, and there's a whole other video explaining why that is. And you're right, it doesn't give you particularly good data, but if you have a 10-gun salvo, it gives you 5 not particularly brilliant points of data in a very quick sequence, which you can then hopefully refine down to, okay, maybe these are the areas that we focus on with half salvos of 4 or 5 guns. But whether you're firing 2, 3, 4, or 5 guns out of your total broadside, the general point is to get shells in the air, then to get another set of shells in the air heading for a slightly different aim point, which then means that while you're reloading your entire set of guns, you have 2 or more sets of data with which to further refine your calculations, rather than fire everything at one point, and then if that misses, you now have to wait about a minute or so until you can get another data point. Which means that statistically, if your opponent is getting 2 or 3 data points in that same amount of time, they're more likely to home in on you before you home in on them, and then they can start firing full salvos at an accurate data point. But what all this means in terms of our core question is that a battleship may well have some shells in the air, and then before those shells land, have other shells in the air heading for a different point. Which means that if by chance, or perhaps judgment, one of those early part salvos lands and actually scores a hit, then there will already be another half salvo or more in the air aimed at points which are not that original point, and therefore are all going to miss. So from the perspective of the ship that's hit, you would take a hit or two and be thinking, oh no, there's a bunch more shells in the air, we're surely doomed, only to watch that line of shells steadily march away from you in one direction or the other. And of course, back on the ship that's actually fired those shells, when you see one of your part salvos actually land, you've then got to work out, hang on a minute, which one was that? What settings were we using for that one? Let's dial back to that and hopefully get the next one on target. And of course, they may not actually reset the fire control system exactly right, and therefore the next salvo might also be a miss, but they'll probably start dialing in your range again. And naturally, we're looking at each of these specific scenarios in isolation, because there is a reasonable chance, again, if the ship isn't in a battle line and therefore somewhat fixed, that the target ship will probably also start taking evasive action. Our third and fourth reasons are actually two sides of the same coin, and they're both to do with the spread of shells that are fired. So reason number 3 is that you might actually not have the correct aim point, but your shell spread might be wide enough to still get you a hit. And then you think, I have hit the enemy, and then you fire again, except, of course, you're still aiming at the wrong point, and so the next salvo of shells will miss completely. Now, what was described at the time as shell spread, we might today know by a number of different names, including circular error probability, or CEP, but essentially what it amounts to is that there will be a radius from your theoretical aim point around which your shells will land. Now, if a gun is fairly inaccurate, that radius might be measured in hundreds upon hundreds of yards or meters, depending on which measurement system you're using. And if it's very accurate, it might be measured in only a couple of 100 yards. But you have to remember, there are 3 feet to a yard, and although a yard is not exactly the same as a meter, it's a slightly shorter measure. For the sake of this explanation, you can treat them as roughly contemporaneous. And that's because if we assume that your target is, roughly speaking, broadside onto you, which you'd expect in a battleship fight, you have to take into account their beam versus your shell spread. Now, even if we consider a fairly generous case, so we look at the Yamato, a fairly wide ship as far as battleships go, in fact, pretty much the widest, she is still just under 128 feet wide, or a little bit under 43 yards. A decent shell spread at the time would be considered to be around about 300 yards, give or take. So if we use some very crude graphics now, and we show a 300-yard circle with a rectangle that actually matches the length and width of Yamato precisely, at its greatest points, obviously, you can see how the actual aim point might be, in this case, 150 yards over from where Yamato is, but an area within that spread actually still covers the ship. And in a half salvo, there will be 4 or 5 shells randomly distributed within that circle. If it's a full salvo, because they think they have found the range, there might be 8 or 9 shells in a World War II context, possibly more in a World War I context, distributed within that circle. And although the bit bounded by the Yamato block is not a majority, it's not even a quarter, there is still a statistically significant chance that one of those shells might well hit Yamato. But it's not a guarantee. Assuming a full salvo of 8 or 9 shells, you're probably looking at a probability of around maybe 1 in 3, give or take a little bit. But of course, if a hit is seen and the enemy ship decides, well, we have managed to hit the ship, therefore our range estimates are correct, and they fire another salvo based on this data, well, if we just said that let's say the odds of actually scoring a hit with this kind of setup are 1 in 3, well, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that the next salvo is going to miss. Which brings us on to point number 4, which is that you might actually have the correct range, but your shell spread might betray you for the next salvo. So returning again to our hilariously simple graphics, here our aim spot is absolutely dead center on our theoretical Yamato-sized rectangle target. This is pretty much the best that we can hope for in terms of fire control solutions, and yet you can see we have, with our 300-yard circle, our shell spread, the vast majority of the area covered by that spread is in pink, which means it's still not going to hit, even though our aim is perfect. The fact this ends up looking a bit like a UK traffic stop sign with different coloration is completely coincidental, actually. So in this scenario, with a perfect aim, you might well land 1 or 2 or 3 shell hits in your first salvo, but especially if you're firing a 4 or 5 gun half salvo, and perhaps even if you're firing an 8 or 9 gun full salvo, you can very immediately see how, since the vast majority of the area covered by the shell spread is still just open sea, it's entirely possible that the follow-up salvo or half salvo might not actually score any hits. It just requires the shot distribution to be above or below, in the case of this picture, or short or long in naval terms, and that salvo might not do any further damage. And yes, I can hear those of you at the back yelling that the shell spread shape for naval gunnery is not actually a perfect circle, it's more of a slightly distorted oval or an oblong in the direction of gunfire. So perhaps it should look a little bit more like this, but well, not only can you see how this actually makes the problem worse, but it's just easier to draw circles and it gets across the general point. But just in case you were interested, this is a block the size of a Leander class cruiser in a shell spread oval that approximates some of the worst recorded performance of a Littorio class battleship. And, well, yeah, now you understand why they didn't hit anything, even if the rangefinders were giving them the exact perfect fire control solution. And that brings us to our final reason, reason number 5, and that is that you might accidentally end up hitting somebody using the wrong data, but compensated for by other errors in your system. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take a very simple example. Let's say you have 2 ships sailing perfectly parallel to each other at a given range. Now, if you think that the target ship is traveling at, let's say, 20 knots, and you know the time of flight of your shell, so you're going to aim ahead of the enemy by a given distance. So you fire, expecting to score a hit. Now, as it turns out, in fact, your opponent is traveling at 24 knots, so your shell is going to miss. Except you actually aimed a little bit too far forward for what your inaccurate fire control solution was, by, let's say a degree or 2. And as a result, you're actually leading the target by a bit more than you thought, which means that the shell is then going to hit. And at that point, you're going to be thinking, great, our fire control solution was actually accurate. We fired, we scored a hit. Let's fire again on that target solution. Except, of course, as both your ship and the enemy ship continue to move, your guns have to continue tracking. And if at some point during that tracking, the system corrects the tracking error, so now your turrets are actually pointing in the direction of the actual fire control solution, well, your next salvo is going to land behind the enemy, which is what it should have done in the first place. And similarly, you can make errors in range where you think, let's say, the range is 20,000 yards, the enemy is actually 21,000 yards away, but for whatever reason, either your guns are aimed slightly too high, or the ship pitches up a little bit more violently than was anticipated, but for whatever reason you shoot a little bit high, you score a hit, and then the next time round, those set of circumstances don't reoccur, and you miss. Now, those are two very simplistic scenarios, but it can get even more complex in terms of a naval battle. Now, granted, as complexity goes up, the number of factors that have to align for you to still get a hit also increases, and therefore things become more and more unlikely. But again, as a review of any capital ship engagement will show, the unlikely is potentially one of the most likely things to happen in battleship and battlecruiser engagements. So a not so complex, but still somewhat more complex example might be you see your enemy is turning, and you think you know how sharply they're turning and what speed they're going. So let's say you think they're taking a fairly wide turn, a turn with a fairly large radius, at a high speed, but with a fairly sharp change of bearing. In fact, they might be taking a fairly shallow turn at a slower speed, so ultimately their arc of travel is going to be considerably larger, but in the short term, they're actually traveling a shorter distance. If you then open fire based on your incorrect assumption, there is a chance that actually, in the time it takes your shells to arrive, the two projected course paths actually intersect around about the time that your shells arrive. So again, you might score a hit, and you think, great, I know where the ship is going, I'm now going to fire ahead again based on this set of data, except of course that the enemy ship is actually going in a completely different direction, which means your next salvo will miss. So there you go. 5 different ways in which a battleship might fire on another capital ship, or perhaps a smaller target, might register a hit, but then miss with follow-up salvos. So I hope you found that interesting, and see you again in another video.